This is an ART302 video on classifying musical instruments and specifically the musical instruments of the Western Orchestra. If you'd like to follow in your textbook, you can do so. We are on page 176. So there are two most common ways to classify musical instruments. The first is to group them according to the way they're grouped in a Western orchestra. And there are four families of instruments in the Western Orchestra, namely strings, woodwind, brass, and percussion. The second way is to group instruments according to how their sound is produced. This is going to be dealt with in the next video, which deals with specifically African instruments. But in this video, we're going to look at the way they're grouped in the Western Orchestra. So we're dealing with the blue box in this video. So what exactly is an orchestra? An orchestra is a large instrumental ensemble that contains different sections of instruments, so different types of instruments. And the term orchestra derives from the Greek word, and I'm not even going to try to say that, which is the name for the area in front of an ancient Greek stage reserved for the Greek chorus. If you think about the sorts of Greek arenas with a massive semicircle of seats, that space down at the bottom in the middle is what would be reserved for the Greek chorus, and that is where the term orchestra comes from. Orchestras can be different sizes. A full-size orchestra would be about 100 musicians, but they can be smaller, 50 musicians or even fewer. Sometimes the smaller ones are known as chamber orchestras. And orchestras might also be known as symphony orchestras or philharmonic orchestras. In fact, the orchestra we have in KwaZulu-Natal is called the KZNPO, the KwaZulu-Natal Philharmonic Orchestra. So the orchestra is made up of different sections, and today we're going to talk about these different sections. Let's look at them briefly now in the layout that you would see them on a stage. At the bottom, close to the edge of the stage and to the conductor, we have the strings section. We have the woodwind section. You'll see most of these instruments are dark, sort of made out of wood with silver pieces on them. Behind them, and often to the right, is our brass section. You'll see all these instruments look golden and quite sort of brassy. Back on the left side, we have the percussion instruments. So we're going to talk about each section individually, and we'll start with the string section. So what exactly are stringed instruments? Stringed instruments are musical instruments that produce sound from vibrating strings. If you've ever played the guitar or seen someone play the guitar, you'll notice that the sound is created as the string vibrates. As soon as the person playing it puts their hand on the string to stop the vibration, the sound stops. And it's exactly the same with our string instruments. The sound is produced by vibrating strings. The longer and the thicker the string, the lower the sound it produces. So what instruments might we find in the strings section? So what exactly are our string instruments? Here on the left side we have our violins, followed by the violas, the cellos, and on the right our double basses. And you'll notice these four instruments look the same, they just have bigger bodies. So our violins are going to be our highest because they're the smallest, shortest strings. And our double basses are going to be the lowest because they're the biggest with the longest strings. Another instrument that fits into the string section is our harp, which sits over there. So let's talk about each one, or let's see a picture of each one individually. There we have our violins, our violas, cello, and our double basses. So all four have curvy wooden bodies and long necks, and they all look very similar but different sizes. The violin is the smallest and produces the highest sound, followed by the viola, which produces a slightly lower sound than the violin. Next is the cello. The cello is so big that the musician has to put it between his or her legs to play it. And finally the double bass, which is so big that the musician either needs to stand to play it or sometimes sort of perches on a cocktail stool. This is the lowest of the 4 instruments, and you can see also has the longest strings. Each instrument has 4 strings stretched from the pegs at the top over the body to the tail piece, and those pegs are tightened or loosened to tune the instrument. The sound is produced when a bow is stroked over the strings, or the strings can also be plucked to produce a short detached sound, and this is known as pizzicato. As I said, the string instruments also include the harp. The harp has 47 strings and 7 pedals. You'll see the pedals at the bottom. The pedals are pressed to adjust the sound to make it higher or slightly lower. And sound is produced when the strings are plucked. So moving on now to our woodwind instruments. What are woodwind instruments? A woodwind instrument is a musical instrument which uses air to produce sound. The player blows air through a reed, causing the air to vibrate. And a reed is made of wood, most often bamboo, and attached to the top of the instrument. And the reed vibrates as the air is blown through it. The longer the instrument's tube, the lower the sound will be. So I hope you're noticing a pattern here. Same with the strings, the longer the lower, and it follows with our woodwinds as well. The longer the instrument, the lower the sound will be. So what instruments might we find in our woodwind section? Here we have our oboes. Next to the oboes are the flutes, our clarinets, and our bassoon. So let's look at our woodwind instruments. First of all, we have our piccolo and our flute. The piccolo is the highest instrument in the woodwind family, followed by the flute. Now, the piccolo wasn't on the slide before, and that's because it's not always included in the orchestra. It depends on if the composer, which is the person who writes the music, writes a part for the piccolo. The piccolo, you'll see as well, is identical to the flute. It's just shorter and therefore higher. So the flautist in the orchestra will play the piccolo when necessary. Both the piccolo and the flute are played by blowing air over the hole at the top of the instrument, which is like if you blow air across the top of a glass bottle and you manage to produce a sound. The movement is very similar to the way one would play the flute. Our next 2 instruments are the clarinet and the saxophone. Now, the saxophone is not normally included in the Western orchestra. It's much more of a jazz instrument, but we've included it here because both of these instruments include a single reed. And we've said a reed is a small wooden insert that is placed at the entrance of the instrument, often made out of bamboo. It's the reed that vibrates to create the sound. Our next 2, our oboe and bassoon, have double reeds or 2 reeds. So the reeds are placed against each other, and the vibration is caused as they move against each other. The bassoon, you will see, has the longest tube and therefore creates the lowest sound. All of the instruments have holes in the tubes, and different sounds are created by covering and uncovering these holes with the fingers. And this is what's going to create different pitches in the music. So high notes and low notes. Right, our next section is our brass section. So what exactly are brass instruments? Brass instruments firstly are made from brass, which is a kind of metal. And a brass instrument is a musical instrument whose sound is produced by a vibration of air from the player's lips. To play a brass instrument, the brass players literally buzz their lips together. And the closest thing I can liken this to is playing a vuvuzela. You push your lips together, but at the same time you push air out of the lips. So the lips kind of buzz together. What instruments might we find in the brass section? Our orchestra, we have our trumpet over here. Next to the trumpet we have the trombone, the French horn, and our largest brass instrument, the tuba. Let's look at each one individually. Here we have our trumpet. This is the highest of all of the instruments. That is what the trombone looks like. There's the French horn, and the biggest of all, the tuba. So as we've said, these brass instruments are made of brass, which is a type of metal, and they are long cylinders which have been curled and shaped into different forms to allow the player to hold the instrument. If you look at the French horn, look at how many sort of curls there are in that long tube. And the trumpet also has curls, as does the tuba. So the sound is produced as the air moves along these different tubes. And following on from our rule, the longer the tube, the lower the sound that's going to be created. The sound is produced in these instruments when the player blows through the hole with vibrating lips. And the action of buzzing the lips together is the same for all of these brass instruments. Different pitches are created by the combination of mouth positions and covering valves. You'll see the valves on these instruments. They're most obvious on the tuba. They're the buttons that the musician will press down to create different pitches or sounds. And you'll see them on the trumpet, the French horn, and the tuba. The trombone is slightly different. The different pitches are created by the musician sliding the instrument out or sliding it back in again. So our final section is our percussion section. What exactly is a percussion instrument? A percussion instrument is a musical instrument that is sounded by being struck or scraped by a beater, or struck, scraped or rubbed by a hand, such as a drum, or struck against a similar instrument, which might be like a cymbal. When we play the cymbals, we have two identical instruments that we bang together. Percussion instruments can be melodic or non-melodic. So what do we mean by this? A melodic instrument is able to create different pitches and can create a melody. And examples here might be the xylophone or the piano. Non-melodic percussion instruments are not pitched, so they're not tuned and there's no definite pitch for them. For example, a drum or a tambourine. What percussion instruments might we find in the orchestra? Well, in this orchestra we have cymbals, we have timpani, which is this collection of kettle drums, and we have a piano. Now the percussion section in an orchestra is always going to be different. It depends on the instruments that the composer wanted to be played in the percussion section. So sometimes you might see a tambourine, sometimes you might see a triangle. It really depends on what the composer wanted. At our melodic percussion instruments, we said we have the piano and we have the xylophone as examples. There are others as well. The piano, the sound is created by a hammer that knocks on the strings that are inside the body of the piano. That's why it's a percussion instrument, because the hammer hits against the strings. In the xylophone, the way that the sound is created is by the musician hitting the wooden blocks with a beater or some kind of a stick. And that is why it is also a percussion instrument, because the action of the person playing involves hitting down on the wooden blocks. There are many non-melodic percussion instruments, and we'll just look at a couple of them. They can be classed into a variety of subcategories. If we look at wooden percussion instruments, here we have the two sticks, which are known as claves. Those are knocked against each other to create a sound. And we have the castanets, which are also knocked against each other to create sound. Other wooden percussion instruments might be a wooden block or any kind of stick that's used. We have metal percussion instruments, and the examples here, we have the cymbals and the triangle. Other metal instruments might be jingles or bells. Here we have instruments for special effects. We have the shakers here. We could have maracas, which are also types of shakers. Sandpaper blocks might also be included in this section. And probably our most well-known or famous are our membrane instruments, which are our drums. Called membrane instruments because a membrane is pulled over a frame to create and hit to create a sound. Here, this section might include a hand drum, tambourine, snare drum, and bongo drum. The example that you'll see in front of you is a snare drum. So for extra information on the orchestra, I have loaded 2 web pages onto our ECI page, and I encourage you to go and have a look at both of them, to follow both of the links. And this is going to give you an important opportunity to hear these different instruments, which unfortunately we haven't been able to do in this video. The first one, SFS Kids, San Francisco Kids, is a child-orientated site which might be very nice to use in your classroom one day. It works well on a tablet. It's very interactive. You click on the different sections and you can hear the different instruments. They give examples of different pieces of music that might include the instrument, and they have the examples right there. So that's very nice and child-friendly. The second website, the Philharmonia, is more adult. But what's nice about this one is you can watch a little video on each of the orchestral instruments, and you can hear the instrument being played, and you can hear the musician talking a little bit about the instrument, so giving you some information. In KwaZulu-Natal, we're extremely lucky to have the KZNPO, who travel around the province doing concerts at schools. So the KZNPO is strongly committed to education and development through a 3-pronged approach, offering arts exposure, skills training, and performance opportunities. The orchestra reaches thousands of school children annually through its ongoing school concerts. So when you are a teacher one day, I urge you to be in touch with the education officer and to invite the KZNPO to your school. It is a wonderful experience for children to be able to hear an actual orchestra play, and they do wonderful, wonderful educational programs for children.